Hi, this is Bharti, and we are here at Oracle OpenWorld in San Francisco. And today we have with us Aimee Lucido. You are a software engineer and also author of Emmy in Key of Code.
Yes.
So first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You delivered a talk here at the event. Tell us a bit about your talk first.
So I was one of the walk-ons during the keynote, the first one back on Monday. And so I was talking a little bit about my upcoming novel, Emmy in the Key of Code, which is a story about a 12-year-old girl who comes from a family of musicians, but she feels like she herself is not actually very good at music. Even though she thinks in it and she loves music, she doesn't feel like she can make it. And so when she moves to San Francisco for her dad's job as a pianist in the symphony orchestra, she decides, I'm not taking music anymore, I'm not good at it, and she ends up in a computer science class. And she ends up surprising herself with how much she loves it. And not only loving it, but also rediscovering music through the lens of computers. And what I think makes the book really special is that it's written in this novel in verse format. So a novel in verse is a single story like a novel, but it's told in a series of short poems. But as she learns to code, the poetry actually starts to incorporate the if statements and while loops of Java. So the idea is a kid would read the book first for the story, but accidentally learn a little bit of Java at the same time.
I have a lot of questions for you, but
Yeah,
first question is, when and how you got the idea for this book?
So I was reading a book called The Red Pencil. It's a novel in verse by this woman named Andrea Davis Pinckney. And something about how she was using tabs and colons and new lines and spaces made me think of the coding language Python. And I had never made this association before, that code and poetry could be similar, but all at once I was sort of struck with the realization that both code and poetry are just English. They are ways of explaining something, but they're both things that people can sometimes find impenetrable or feel they're a little bit intimidating, but neither of them actually have to be that hard. And so I didn't think anyone had ever tried to make a connection between code and poetry before. And so I decided I was going to try. And so that was the day that Emmy in the Key of Code was born.
And how much of the story that you told is your own story?
There's a little bit that's my own story. I mean, I don't think it's possible to write a book without putting some of yourself into the book. There are no characters that are based on anybody that I know. The character's name being Emmy and my name being Aimee was actually an accident. I didn't even realize it because they don't look the same. It wasn't until my sister told me this, and she was like, man, you're arrogant, putting your own name into the book, that I even knew that they were similar. So maybe it was subconscious. But the story, it's less a literal representation of my life and more sort of my way of working out this, what are the differences and what are the similarities between coding and poetry and music? Because I'm a software engineer, I'm a writer, I'm a musician, and I've been doing these things for so long. And they're things that people sometimes when they hear about them, they say, oh, well, those seem like such opposites. But they never really seemed like opposites to me. They just seemed like just ways of creating. They were tools. And so when I realized this, I realized this through writing the book actually, that I didn't have to be one or the other, that I could kind of find the common ground between these things that people think of as so different. And then that ended up being Emmy's journey in the story.
Actually, I agree with you, because if you look at, there are certain things which are universal, maths, music, and I think Jim Zemlin or somebody from the Linux Foundation, he once said, that these software developers are like poets,
Mm-hmm.
that we are just curating their poetry.
Yeah.
So code is like poetry,
Yeah.
basically.
And sometimes I get recruiter emails that'll be like, apply to our company. So like they'll phrase the recruiting email like it's code. And so, it isn't like a totally novel concept that code is just like a human readable language. But I think that we have yet to see that being done in like the format of a fiction story, and particularly for young people and particularly for young girls.
So that also brings me to another question, that is, who is the target audience of this book?
So the book is ages 8 to 12. That's the advertised age range. That being said, the story there's nothing, scandalous, or it's very inoffensive as sort of the story goes. So I could see kids as young as a very advanced 7-year-old reader being able to read it, no problem. Something I also tried to do is to hide little code jokes and little musical jokes in the book. So an older reader who maybe has a bit of coding background or a bit of musical background could read it and like zoom through it because it's a very quick read, but maybe find deeper levels to the poetry that a younger reader might not. So I think I find the age range to be a little bit broader than 8 to 12, but that is the advertised range.
So how did you, because the age group that you choose, the way they talk, the kind of language they use, the understanding there, how you manage to create a work of art which is targeted at that audience?
I think that my inner voice is very young. I think that I stopped reading for a time when I was in high school. And I think the reason for that is that I was always a good reader. Like reading was always something I had to like impress people with. And so there was a period of time where I stopped reading because my like skill level at reading was higher than the type of book that I was actually interested in reading. So I felt like I had to read things like War and Peace or, the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. When I wanted to be reading was more like the Redwall series, but I wouldn't let myself because that, I was too smart for that. And so I stopped reading for years. And it wasn't until the end of college when I gave myself permission to start reading kids books again that I actually regained my love of reading and therefore my love of writing. And so, I'm pulling from my own experiences, my own problems that I had in middle school. But I think also it just comes from this love of books written for kids. If I think about what my favorite books were over the course of my life, they were mostly books that I read when I was 10 years old.
Right.
And so I think that's sort of why I've ended up writing for that age range.
Is it more challenging to write for that? I have 2 kids, so when I read their book, they are very simplified. So as a writer, I find it challenging, to just, put myself in, because how they observe things, so was it more challenging?
I don't know about what would be, for me, there's the story I want to tell, and what I try to do is write the story as truthfully to that specific character as possible. So if that character is 12 years old, so like Emmy is 12 years old, or she's 11 years old, but she has a vast musical knowledge, and that's because of how she was raised. And so I would write that character very differently than I would write a character who's more on the coding side of things. And so I try very hard to think about what would the specific character do. And so then they're not necessarily an age as they are a person. And I think also, revision is such a big part of writing that sometimes you do put something in that you decide later is too old or too young, and then you'll pull that out and you'll change it. So I do, it's definitely, it does feel a little bit like an oxymoron to have adults writing kids' books or writing as kids.
J.K. Rowling wrote a book for kids, so it's not. No, I was, as a writer, I was just interested in the process that you had there. First of all, what is the story behind the name in the, number one? Number two is that, you cannot tell us a lot about the book. You want people to read. So, but what is the key takeaway from this book, or why somebody should read it?
So I'll start with the name. So the title is Emmy in the Key of Code. That was not the original title. When I first started writing it, the title was actually The Music My Keyboard Makes, which I actually still like, but it's a little bit clunky. It's not something that a kid would necessarily see and pull off the shelf. So over time, I decided to change the title, and the title that we decided on, just like my friends and I, was In the Key of Code. And that came a little bit from Stevie Wonder's album Songs in the Key of Life. But we did go back and forth a little bit, before I even sold it, whether it should be Songs in the Key of Code or Emmy in the Key of Code or just In the Key of Code. We ended up selling it as In the Key of Code. They ended up adding the Emmy to the front, although there were alternative titles. One of them was Decoding Emmy, or Emmy Decoded. But actually the funny thing is the UK version of the book, because we sold the rights to different countries, the UK is actually still calling it In the Key of Code, because when we sold it, it was In the Key of Code, but it was only the US publishers decided to add the Emmy onto it, which might sound familiar because Harry Potter was it was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone in the UK, so it's not unheard of to have different titles. But it's kind of interesting. It's been interesting to be a part of that process.
And how did you manage to get, Oracle, have you done any work in, any of the Oracle products or projects? Or how did you land here?
So George Saab reached out to me. and on Twitter. And we had never had any communication before that. And he asked me why I chose Java. And my answer was Java was the language that I learned to code in. Java is the language I've been coding in my entire life. And so Java had to be the language I wrote this book in. I wouldn't know how to write it in any other language. And he said, we have this big Java conference, Code One, next week. We're looking for walk-ons for the keynote. Would you like to be one? And I said, absolutely. Because, you write a book and you write it in a vacuum and then suddenly it goes out into the world, but the vast majority of its readers are teachers and librarians and book people. But this is such a big coding element. I really wanted it to get into the hands of the coding world. And so this is, the Code One conference is exactly my audience for that half of my readership. So I said absolutely when he asked if I wanted to come speak.
So Twitter can be useful in some cases too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key takeaways that I would like a kid to walk out of Emmy and the Key of Code with would be that coding isn't scary. I think kids and just people in general, not even just kids, when they think of code, they think of like ones and zeros and bits and bytes and like the matrix and I mean there are pieces of coding that deal with like that low level of stuff. But I think people are very surprised when they realize that code is actually just English. I've given this book to a lot of adults and they say, I'm probably not the best reader for this. I don't know math. And first of all, coding and math are not the same thing. And second of all, if I did my job correctly, you don't need to know anything about coding to read the book. And every person who has ever started the conversation with, I'm not going to get it, I don't know math, at the end of reading the book, they actually, not only do they get it, they're like, I understand coding now, like I know how it works a little bit. And so that's pretty cool. So I want kids to walk away knowing that coding isn't scary. And I also wanted them to walk away with the idea that, over the course of your life, you'll be told that you can only choose one thing to be. That when you're a little kid, when you're in kindergarten, and people ask you what you want to be when you grow up, you say a firefighter and a painter and an astronaut and a dog and a train conductor, and I also want to be in the Olympics. And at some point in our lives, we're told we can only choose one of those things. And that's really sad because I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm only 28. In the course of my life, I've been a software engineer, I've been a musician, I've been an author, and now I get to travel and speak to kids about coding, and that's really, really cool. And I'm young, and so who knows what more could possibly happen. And so, Emmy's dilemma is deciding whether she can be both a musician and a coder. And so I want kids to walk away realizing they don't have to choose, that they can choose both.
Or they can be a writer or author as well.
Yeah, or that. They can be whatever they want, and they don't need to choose just one thing.
Since you are a software engineer yourself, are there any Easter eggs that can somebody just compile this book and get some working code there?
There are definitely some sections of code that are compilable. A lot of the code in the glossary is compilable. There's one actual piece of at one point the teacher writes a bit of code in Java to calculate the first 1,000 digits of pi, and so that code is in the book as actual code that should compile. If we did our job right, it compiles, and kids can generate it themselves. There are also little bits of poems as you get later in the book, and she actually starts to get into methods and semicolons and a little bit more syntax that will, very small bits that will compile. But I don't know if you would get anything meaningful out of those bits of code.
Awesome. Are we going to see a Netflix series also on your book?
I mean, if you know someone at Netflix, put us in touch.
Awesome. Thank you, Emmy, so much for talking to me, and
Absolutely.
good luck with your book.
Thank you so much.